You don't belong here. Get on the ground. The voice cut through the quiet suburban street like a siren. Lieutenant Richard Sloane's hand hovered over his holster as he and his partner stormed out of their cruiser. The man they were yelling at, tall, black, in a gray hoodie and sweatpants, was standing calmly on the sidewalk outside a modern two-story house. He didn't flinch, didn't run, just turned slowly with raised eyebrows, as if surprised that anyone would speak to him like that. I said on the ground, Sloane barked again, already approaching. The man didn't resist. Is there a problem, officer? His tone was low, controlled. Not hostile, but that didn't matter. You match the description, Sloane snapped. Of what? Suspicious activity. You've been loitering in front of this house. I'm waiting for someone, the man said evenly. I have every right. Down on the ground. That was when Officer Mark Baines moved behind him. No warning, no hesitation. A shove to the back, a knee to the legs. The man fell hard onto the pavement, hands open, body tense, but compliant. Baines yanked his arms back, cuffing him while Sloane barked commands that blurred together. Who are you? What are you doing in this neighborhood? You think we're stupid? You're lucky we got here first and not someone with less patience. The man winced as the cuffs dug into his wrists. Still, he didn't protest. Even when gravel cut into his palms, even when Sloane leaned in close and said, Guys like you don't usually stroll through these streets unless you're casing a place. A woman across the street gasped. Another neighbor peeked through their blinds. A teenager walking a dog froze, then slowly pulled out their phone to start filming. Sir, the man said again, breathing steady, you're making a mistake. Yeah? Sloane sneered. Why don't you tell me who you're waiting for? He turned his head slightly, eyes locked with Sloane's. You. A flicker of confusion passed across the officer's face, but he shook it off. Cute. Check my ID. Baines pulled the wallet from the man's pocket, flipped it open, read it once, then again. His hand stilled. Sloane noticed. What? Baines didn't respond. Sloane snatched the ID from him. His eyes scanned the name. Terrence A. Mosley. Below it, in bold gold lettering, Chief of Police, City of Brentwood. Sloane's mouth fell open. You've got to be kidding me. Terrence slowly sat up, not asking, not waiting, the cuffs still on. Gravel stuck to his hoodie. His knee was scraped, a thin line of blood trailing down his leg. Get those off me, he said. Neither officer moved. I said, he repeated, take them off. Baines stepped forward, hands trembling slightly, and fumbled with the keys. The cuffs clicked open. Terrence stood, dignified, silent. Sloane stammered, Sir, this wasn't if we had known. That's the problem, Terrence said. You didn't care to know. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't have to be. It cut sharper than anything shouted. You profiled me, you assaulted me, and you did it with cameras recording. He glanced toward the growing cluster of bystanders. At least 3 phones were up now. Someone had already gone live. Another was narrating in a shocked whisper. I suggest you radio your captain, Terrence said. Now. Sloane didn't move. Do it, Baines whispered. Sloane finally turned toward the cruiser and called it in. Terrence didn't wait. He walked up the path to the house, the one he had been trying to approach when the officers descended on him, the same house he would be moving into by the end of the week. He rang the doorbell. A stunned assistant opened it wide. Sir, I thought you were arriving later. I was. Back outside, the sirens of a second unit approached. This time, a senior officer stepped out. Captain Russell Foster. Older, red-faced, sweat already beading at his collar. He looked from Terrence to the 2 officers and immediately understood the gravity. Chief Mosley, he said, swallowing hard. Sir, this is a terrible misunderstanding. Terrence looked at him. You'll address this with the same urgency you would if I were anyone else, because right now I am, and I want their badges on your desk by morning. Foster hesitated. Sir, we may want to. Captain, Terrence said, voice like iron, do not finish that sentence. Foster nodded once. Yes, sir. Terrence turned, walking back toward the curb, his steps measured. As he passed the crowd, he made eye contact with the young boy holding a phone. The kid lowered it slowly. You okay, mister? Terrence gave a small nod. I am now. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Because by the time he stepped into the back of the unmarked car that finally arrived, half the city already knew what had happened, and the other half was about to. The silence in the precinct's main hall was deafening when Terrence Mosley stepped through the doors. No fanfare, no formal introduction. Just the weight of everything that had already happened walking into the place that now had no choice but to acknowledge him. He walked past the front desk, past the eyes that tried not to meet his, past whispers that froze mid-breath. Everyone had heard. Some had watched the video. The rest had heard enough to fill in the blanks. Terrence wore a simple suit, gray, crisp, and quiet. No medals, no bars, just presence. Captain Foster met him near the conference room. Chief, he said stiffly, we've cleared the room for your command introduction, per protocol. This won't be that kind of meeting, Terrence replied. Not today. Foster cleared his throat. Understood. They walked into the room. 14 officers seated around a U-shaped table turned slowly. 2 of them stood, Sloan and Baines. Terrence didn't acknowledge them first. Instead, he took the center of the room and let the silence settle again. I don't need to explain who I am, he said. You already know, and if you don't, look it up. He looked slowly around the room. I'm not here for applause. I'm not here for tradition. I'm here because this department is broken. And now, I know that from personal experience. A few people shifted uncomfortably. What happened yesterday wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the result of a culture that's gone unchecked for too long. A culture that teaches suspicion before listening, force before inquiry, power before purpose. Sloane's jaw tightened. Baines looked like he wanted to vanish. Terrence continued. I don't care about how long you've been on the force. I don't care how many commendations you've stacked. If you think a badge means permission to humiliate, intimidate, or dehumanize the public, then your time here is over. He let the weight of that sink in before he turned directly to Sloane. Lieutenant? Sloane stood. Sir. You tackled a civilian without cause. You cuffed him without verifying identity. You ignored every protocol of de-escalation. Sloane straightened. We received a call about a suspicious person on private property. I was standing on a public sidewalk, Terrence cut in. Sloane hesitated. We didn't know it was you, and that's the only reason you regret it. Murmurs rose around the room. Foster coughed lightly, attempting to restore order, but Terrence raised a hand. No need. Let them hear it. He turned to the room again. If your defense is that you didn't recognize your own chief of police, then what does that say about how you treat every other black man in this city who doesn't wear a badge? No one spoke. You weren't just careless, Terrence added. You were arrogant. He turned back to Baines. You followed his lead. Baines's voice cracked. Yes, sir, I did. Terrence nodded once. Both of you are suspended, effective immediately, pending internal review and civilian oversight. Sloane's mouth opened, but no words came out. Baines sat down slowly, almost grateful. Terrence stepped forward again. I know how these rooms work. I know what gets said after the doors close, so let me be clear. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to make sure that the next time someone sees a black man walking in their neighborhood, the first response isn't panic and a call to arms. He scanned the room one last time. You don't have to like me, but you will respect this office. And you will change, or you'll leave. Then he turned and walked out. No applause, no nods, just silence. As he made his way to his new office upstairs, a few officers parted like water around him in the hall. Others watched from behind screens or doorways, some with admiration, some with bitterness, most with confusion. Inside his office, the blinds were half open, casting long stripes of sunlight across the desk. He sat down. For the first time, alone, Terence let out a slow breath. He had meant every word. But he also knew this wasn't over. They hadn't learned anything yet. They'd only seen what it looked like when someone powerful got humiliated. Now they needed to understand what it meant when someone powerless did. And that fight? That was just beginning. By the following morning, the incident was no longer just a precinct problem. It was a citywide reckoning. The video had gone viral, first on local Twitter threads, then picked up by national news. Commentators debated it on morning talk shows. Community leaders gave statements. And though the faces in the footage were blurred, everyone knew exactly who was who. The headline was simple: newly appointed police chief mistaken for criminal, forced to the ground by his own officers. Terence didn't watch the full clip. He didn't need to. He had felt every second of it. Instead, he sat in his office with a growing stack of reports in front of him. Complaints, past grievances, disciplinary records, some going back a decade. Many of them marked inconclusive or resolved internally. Names repeated, patterns emerged. One officer's file contained 5 civilian complaints about excessive force. All dismissed, no follow-up interviews, no review board. Just a quiet shuffle and a closed door. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about how often it had happened to others, with no audience, no title, no viral clip. At noon, he called a staff meeting. Not mandatory, just an open invite. Only 5 people came. 3 were rookie officers who sat stiffly, unsure if they should even be in the room. One was a dispatcher who had worked the night shift and showed up anyway. The 5th was Detective LaToya Green. She sat near the back with her arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, like someone who'd been waiting a long time to see what would happen next. Terence didn't give a speech. He placed a stack of redacted complaints on the table. "Read them," he said. "Then tell me if this is the kind of department you want to be part of." One rookie flipped through a file. His face dropped. "They let this go?" he asked. "For years," Terence replied. LaToya leaned forward. "What are you planning to do?" "Sunlight," he said. "We open the files. We talk to the people. We let the public see the rot." The dispatcher frowned. "They'll push back. Union's already whispering about you being political." "I'm not running for office," Terence said. "I'm trying to clean up the house." LaToya stood and walked to the table. She picked up a file and opened it slowly. "I've seen some of these names before," she said. "They float from unit to unit, always land soft." "Not anymore." She met his eyes. "You're going to need allies." He nodded. "I'm not asking for loyalty, just honesty." She smirked. "Then you've got one." By the end of the day, 4 more officers had come forward. Quietly. Some with documents, others with stories. One admitted he'd filed a complaint years ago, only to have it buried. Terence listened to every word. That night, he got a call from the mayor's office. The voice on the other end was tense. "We're fielding press requests non-stop. CNN, MSNBC, local affiliates. They want you on record." "I'm not giving them a headline," Terence said. "I'm giving them a process." "There's also talk about a town hall. Community wants answers." "Then they'll get them," he said. "In person." The mayor hesitated. "You're sure about this?" "I was cuffed in your city's streets for existing. I don't get to be silent now." After hanging up, Terence sat back in his chair. He looked around the office. It was clean, neutral, diplomas on the wall, family photo on the desk. Nothing about it said revolution. But maybe that was the point. In the morning, he walked into the community center on 53rd Street. The building wasn't built for capacity, but every seat was filled. Locals, activists, teachers, pastors, teens. Reporters lined the back wall, phones were up. Live streams were rolling. When he stepped up to the mic, the room went still. "I won't repeat what happened to me," he began. "You've seen it." He looked across the sea of faces. "But I will say this. If it can happen to me, it's probably already happened to someone you love. Someone who didn't get cameras, or apologies, or meetings like this." A murmur spread. Heads nodded. "I was humiliated," he said. "But that humiliation has a purpose now." He opened a folder. "These are redacted files from the last 5 years. Complaints buried, ignored, or dismissed. Some of these names you'll recognize. Some you won't. But they all matter." He set the folder down. "Starting tomorrow, we're opening an anonymous reporting line. Civilian board review, outside oversight, internal culture shift. It won't be fast, it won't be easy. But it starts now." A woman in the front row stood up. Elderly, gray hair, walking stick. "My grandson was stopped and searched last year," she said. "They told him it was routine. He hasn't spoken the same since. Can you promise me it won't happen again?" "No," Terrence said, "but I can promise we'll stop pretending it never happened." The room was silent. Then, applause. Not wild, not performative, but deep. Real. Afterward, people approached him one by one. A high school student who thanked him, a mother with tears in her eyes, a former officer who offered to help. And somewhere in the crowd, a kid in a hoodie stood near the wall. Quiet. Filming. Terrence nodded at him. The kid nodded back. He understood now. This wasn't just about restoring order. It was about restoring trust. And it was only just beginning. The conference room wasn't designed for tension, but it held it well. The lights were too bright, the chairs too stiff, and the silence too long. Terrence stood at the front of the press podium, flanked by 2 community leaders on one side and Captain Foster on the other. A line of local and national news cameras aimed straight at him, red recording lights glowing like warnings. But Terrence wasn't there to flinch. He was there to say what everyone else was too afraid to put on record. "This department has failed to hold itself accountable," he said into the microphone. "That changes today." Click, click. Cameras flashed. A young reporter raised her hand. "Chief Mosley, what action has been taken against the officers involved in your wrongful detainment?" "Effective immediately," Terrence said without hesitation. "Lieutenant Richard Sloan and Officer Mark Baines have been placed on administrative leave without pay, pending a full investigation by the Civilian Oversight Board." A few audible gasps, whispers. Captain Foster shifted beside him but said nothing. "And that's not all," Terrence continued. "We are reopening 23 closed cases where use of force was involved and protocol was potentially violated. We will be naming an independent committee to oversee those reviews. Transparency isn't optional anymore." A man in the third row, middle-aged, stood up without being called on. "You're throwing your own men under the bus." Terrence looked at him. "I'm holding them to the same standard I'd expect from anyone wearing this badge. If that feels like betrayal to you, then maybe your loyalty's in the wrong place." The man sat down. Terrence scanned the room. For years, the public has been told to comply, to cooperate, to trust. But trust has to be earned. And it starts with us admitting the truth, even when it's ugly. A woman in the crowd raised her hand slowly. "You were humiliated publicly, Chief. What makes you want to stay and fight from inside the same building that did that to you?" He paused. Just a second. Then, "Because I want the next black man walking down the street to feel safe, not because he's the chief of police, but because he's human." The room was quiet. Then came the applause. Not polite, not explosive, but steady. From the back rows first. From people who had never clapped for a police officer before. When the press conference ended, Foster followed Terrence out into the hallway. "You're going to catch hell for that." Terrence didn't stop walking. Already did. You're making enemies. Good, Terrence said. That means they're paying attention. Back in his office, he opened an email sent just 10 minutes earlier. The subject line read, "Internal pushback, union demanding meeting." Below that, another email pinged. "Community petition for civilian review board, 25,000 signatures and counting." He leaned back in his chair. Let them both come. That afternoon, Terrence sat with a mother whose son had been stopped outside a gas station 6 months earlier. No charges, no arrest, just a record of the stop that showed up when he applied for college. "I want it erased," she said. He didn't do anything. "We're working on a new expungement protocol," Terrence told her. "We'll review his case first." She looked at him. "Most people just say they're working on it. You actually sound like you mean it." "I do." Later, he walked into the Internal Affairs Division with LaToya Green at his side. She held a folder with 10 new complaints that had resurfaced since the town hall. "People are talking now," she said. "They finally believe someone's listening." "Let's make sure they're right," Terrence replied. They entered the main IA conference room. Several senior officers were seated, stone-faced. One of them, a man named Prescott, who'd been with the department for 30 years, crossed his arms. "You're setting a dangerous precedent, Mosley." "No," Terrence said, placing the files on the table. "You did. When you made silence the rule." Prescott leaned forward. "You really think the public wants us weak?" "No," Terrence said calmly. "I think they want you honest. And frankly, so do I." He opened one of the folders. "This is a complaint against your partner, filed by a 15-year-old, ignored by you, and we're going to talk about it. Now." He didn't blink. Neither did LaToya. The next hour was brutal. Defensive tones, evasion, raised voices. But by the end of it, 3 officers were placed under formal review. One admitted they hadn't followed proper documentation, and for the first time in a long time, the IA boardroom felt less like a bunker and more like a courtroom. When it was over, Terrence stepped outside into the fading light. The sky was turning golden, soft, the kind of light that makes a broken city look whole for a moment. A boy passed by on his bike, slowed down, then stopped. "You're that guy," he said, "from the video." Terrence nodded. The boy looked down. "My cousin said you made the cops mad." Terrence smiled faintly. "Sometimes the right people have to get mad for the wrong ones to stop winning." The boy nodded and pedaled off. Terrence turned back to the building. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the weight of it all, heavier than ever. But now the cracks were visible, and light was starting to pour in. The training room was full, not with officers checking their phones or scribbling notes, but with faces watching, listening. Some were new recruits. Others were seasoned cops who had seen too much and changed too little. At the front stood Chief Terrence Mosley, no podium, no binder, just a simple note card folded in his palm. "There's something different about standing here today," he said. "Not because I'm chief. Because you all saw what happened, and you stayed." No one spoke, but their silence felt less like resistance and more like readiness. "This badge," he said, holding it up for a second, "isn't supposed to protect us from accountability. It's supposed to remind us of responsibility." A young officer raised her hand. "How do we rebuild trust when people hate us?" Terrence nodded. "You earn it one action at a time, and sometimes that means being the first to admit the system's been wrong for a long time." He paused, letting that sit. "And sometimes that means standing up to your own team." After the session, a recruit approached him in the hallway. "My brother got pulled over last year," he said. "Same street you were on. They made him get out, sit on the curb, even though he hadn't done anything. He never filed a complaint, said it wouldn't matter." "It matters now," Terrence replied. "Tell him to come see me." Later that afternoon, Terrence sat at the head of the Civilian Review Board's first official hearing. Across the table was a mother with a folder of documents and trembling hands. She told the story of her son, tased during a stop for a broken taillight, hospitalized for 3 days, charges dropped. No officer ever apologized, she said. Not even a phone call. Terrence didn't interrupt. He just listened. And when she finished, he leaned in. On behalf of this department, he said, I'm sorry, and I promise we'll do more than say that. The board voted unanimously to reopen the case. It was the first of many that week. That evening, Terrence walked into a high school auditorium on the city's west side. The crowd was mostly students, some parents, a few teachers. A panel had been set up on the stage. LaToya Green sat at one end. Terrence took the center. He didn't plan to speak long, but when a kid from the second row stood up and said, "Why didn't they believe you?" he felt the room freeze again. "Because they didn't want to," he answered. "Because people like me in places like that don't fit their version of normal." The kid nodded. "You gonna fire more of them?" "If they keep acting like they're above the law," Terrence said. "Yes." One student clapped, then two, then the whole room. When it was over, he stayed behind while others left. A few students came up to shake his hand. One handed him a folded piece of notebook paper. He read it in his car. It said, "I want to be a cop now, but not like them. Like you." He didn't smile. He just sat there for a while, staring out the windshield at the city. Days later, he was invited to a statewide summit on law enforcement reform. Cameras again, politicians, prepared remarks. But when it was his turn, Terrence walked up, tossed his notes on the table, and said, "I was thrown to the ground on my first week in this job, not because I broke the law, but because of what I looked like. And it happened in broad daylight, on camera, without hesitation." He looked around the room. Some nodded. Some looked away. "If I didn't have a badge, I'd be just another black man with a story no one believed. That's the problem. That's what we're here to fix." Back home, things were quieter. Not peaceful, but steady. One Saturday morning, Terrence returned to the neighborhood where it all began. Same sidewalk. Same house he never got to reach that day. He parked, stepped out, and walked slowly. An elderly man watering his lawn looked up. "Chief Mosley?" Terrence nodded. The man hesitated, then set down the hose. "What they did to you? It was wrong. I didn't say anything back then. I should have." "It's okay," Terrence said. "You're saying it now." Across the street, a teenager waved at him. He recognized the face, one of the bystanders with a phone that day. Terrence crossed over. "You still filming?" he asked. "Always," the kid smiled. "Keep doing that," Terrence said. "Keep them honest." The kid nodded. "You ever think about quitting?" Terrence looked up at the blue sky. "Every day." "Why don't you?" He thought for a second. "Because if I quit, they win. And I didn't come this far just to watch it happen again." As he walked back to his car, he passed by a patrol cruiser slowing down at the intersection. The officer inside rolled down the window. "Afternoon, Chief." "Afternoon." No fear. No tension. Just mutual recognition. Terrence drove off without looking in the rearview mirror. He didn't have to. The city was watching now, and for the first time, it was finally seeing. If this story struck a nerve, if it made you pause, think, or feel something, don't let it end here. Tell us what you felt in the comments. Share your thoughts, your anger, your hope. Hit the like button if you believe stories like this deserve to be seen. And subscribe to our channel, because the fight for justice, for truth, for change, it continues. And we'll be right here, telling the stories that matter.